July 3, 1944. Hollandia Airfield, New Guinea. The tropical heat rose in shimmering waves from the pierced steel planking that served as the runway, curling around the 4P-38 Lightnings as they taxied in from the horizon. The sound of twin Allison engines faded into a metallic hush as the last aircraft rolled to a stop. Dust swirled in lazy spirals around the landing gear. 3 pilots climbed down, their flight suits streaked with sweat and exhaustion, their eyes fixed on the ground crews rushing forward with fuel sticks. Each man knew the drill. Check what was left in the tanks and pray the numbers weren't too low. They'd been flying for 6.5 hours over enemy territory. 6.5 hours of constant tension, fuel gauges creeping toward empty, the horizon an endless sheet of blue water. The first aircraft barely showed 50 gallons remaining. The second, 48. The third, 52. Enough to taxi, but not much more. The ground chief noted the readings with a grim nod. Then came the fourth plane. The pilot shut down both engines and climbed out slowly, his movements calm, almost casual. When the fuel stick slid into the left wing tank, the chief blinked, then checked again. The gauge showed 210 gallons still in reserve. He measured the second tank to be sure. 200 even. The same mission. The same route. The same sky. And yet this man had used less than 2/3 of the fuel the others had burned. The crew exchanged uncertain looks. Someone muttered that the gauges must be wrong. Another said it was impossible. But as the mechanic wiped the stick clean, the truth stared back in glistening fuel marks. The readings didn't lie. Word spread through the airfield like wildfire. By nightfall, every pilot, every crewman, every mechanic in Hollandia was asking the same question. How had one pilot done it? How had he flown twice as far on the same engines everyone else used, and come back with fuel to spare? No one knew that the answer was already walking toward them. Inside a sweltering canvas tent that served as headquarters, 2 men sat at a small wooden table, their shirts clinging to their backs. Colonel Charles MacDonald, commander of the 475th Fighter Group, studied the checkerboard in front of him. Across from him, Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed in concentration. Outside, the distant buzz of insects merged with the drone of generators. The war in the Pacific had turned every day into a blur of routine, missions, briefings, heat, and exhaustion. Checkers was one of the few things that reminded them they were still human. The knock came softly at first, then again. MacDonald barely looked up. "Come in." The flap lifted, and a man stepped through, tall and lean, dressed in crisp navy khakis that somehow looked untouched by the humidity. He was middle-aged, his face lined but steady, his blue eyes sharp and calm. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said in a voice that carried quiet authority. "My name's Charles Lindbergh." MacDonald froze mid-move, his hand still resting on a red checker piece. Across the table, Smith blinked once, then twice. For a long second, the tent was utterly silent except for the hum of a distant aircraft engine. The name hung in the air like smoke from a burning fuse. Charles Lindbergh, the man who had crossed the Atlantic alone 17 years earlier, when flying still felt like witchcraft. The man every pilot had read about as a boy. The man whose courage had turned airplanes from circus acts into serious machines. MacDonald stood, instinctively straightening his uniform. "Mr. Lindbergh, you're the last person I expected to see in New Guinea." "General Hutchinson sent me," Lindbergh replied evenly. "He thought I might be able to assist your group with some observations about long-range flying." Smith leaned forward. "Assist? You mean, you want to fly with us?" "If you'll have me," Lindbergh said simply. They gathered later that afternoon around a wooden table in the cramped operations tent. Maps covered every surface. Routes traced in pencil across endless ocean, dotted with tiny islands that looked insignificant on paper but meant life or death in practice. Colonel Warren Lewis, commander of the 433rd Fighter Squadron, joined them, still damp from a morning briefing. He glanced at Lindbergh and managed a tired smile. "You sure you're in the right place, Mr. Lindbergh? This isn't exactly Paris." Lindbergh's smile was faint. "I'm not here for Paris. I'm here for fuel." Lewis frowned. "Fuel." Lindbergh gestured to the maps. "You're flying missions beyond the P-38's published combat radius. 6 hours, sometimes more. I understand your men are coming back with barely enough to land." "That's an understatement," Lewis said dryly. "We lose more planes to fuel starvation than to enemy fire. The math doesn't work in our favor. The aircraft's rated for a 570-mile combat radius. but we're flying missions up to 700 just to keep up with the offensive. We've done everything by the book, 2200 RPM, auto-rich mixture, the settings the manuals tell us to use. And those settings are what you were taught in flight school, Lindbergh said. Yes, McDonald replied. Every instructor drilled it into us. Never run over square. Never drop your RPM below your manifold pressure. That's how you destroy an Allison engine. Lindbergh studied the map in silence for a moment. His eyes traced the islands, the routes, the fuel notes scribbled in pencil. When he spoke, his voice was calm but deliberate. What if the book is wrong? The question seemed to hang in the humid air, heavier than the heat. Lewis blinked. Wrong. I've been experimenting with engine management for years, Lindbergh said. On long flights, high RPM wastes fuel. What matters isn't how fast the propeller spins. It's how efficiently you burn your mixture. You can run higher manifold pressures with lower RPM and get the same power output for less fuel. McDonald frowned. That goes against every technical order we've ever had. Exactly, Lindbergh said. And yet you're running out of gas. The room fell silent again. The idea sounded insane. Lower RPM meant reduced airflow, reduced cooling, higher stress. It was the kind of thing every pilot was warned never to try. But the numbers didn't lie. 2 days later, the pilots of the 475th gathered in the recreation hut, a patchwork of corrugated steel and palm thatch that passed for a meeting hall. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, oil, and the faint sweetness of aviation fuel. 40 men sat on folding chairs or crates, faces drawn and sunburnt, their eyes fixed on the front of the room. Colonel McDonald stood beside a makeshift podium, an upended ammunition crate. Next to him stood Charles Lindbergh, a notepad in one hand and a single piece of chalk in the other. Gentlemen, McDonald began, Mr. Lindbergh has something to show you. Lindbergh stepped forward. He didn't waste words. He simply turned to the chalkboard and began to write. RPM, 1,600. Manifold pressure, 30-inch. Mixture, auto lean. When he turned back, the silence was almost physical. Those are your new cruise settings, he said. If you use them correctly, you'll reduce your total fuel consumption by up to 30%. A murmur swept through the crowd. Some laughed under their breath. Others just stared. Major Pete Peterson raised a hand. Sir, with all due respect, that's over-square operation. We've been told that would knock our pistons clean out of the block. You've been told wrong, Lindbergh replied, his tone even but firm. At lower RPM, your engines run cooler, not hotter. Higher manifold pressure compensates for reduced revolutions. The result is the same power at a lower fuel burn. Another pilot called out. What about detonation? Engine knock. Not with proper mixture settings, Lindbergh said. Auto lean keeps combustion smooth. You'll burn 70 gallons an hour instead of 100. You'll extend your range by at least a third. For a long moment, no one moved. Finally, a young lieutenant with freckles and tired eyes spoke up. You're saying we could hit targets we've never been able to reach before? Lindbergh nodded. You could fly to the Philippines and back. The words landed like a dropped wrench. McDonald watched his men carefully. He saw curiosity flicker behind their skepticism. He saw fear, too, the kind of fear that comes from breaking habits that kept you alive. Major Peterson crossed his arms. We'll burn the engines up. Maybe, Lindbergh said. Or maybe you've been burning too much already. That night, long after the meeting ended, McDonald sat outside the operations tent, listening to the night insects and the distant thunder of artillery from the west. The airfield lights shimmered against the jungle mist. He turned the numbers over in his mind, fuel flow rates, manifold pressures, airspeed calculations. Everything Lindbergh had said made sense mathematically. But sense and survival weren't always the same thing. Inside, Smith was still awake, scribbling in a notebook. You think he's right? McDonald exhaled slowly. I think he's either a genius, or we're about to find out the hard way. Outside, the air hummed with life, the jungle breathing around them. Somewhere beyond the palm trees, for P-38s sat in the moonlight, their silver skins glinting faintly. By dawn, one of them would carry a civilian pilot into the sky, and everything the U.S. Army Air Forces believed about flying would be tested against the truth of the Pacific horizon. July 4, 1944. The sky over Hollandia was clear, the kind of blue that made the Pacific look infinite. The air smelled faintly of oil and sea salt as ground crews moved along the line of silver aircraft, checking propellers, securing ammunition, topping fuel tanks to the brim. Each P-38 stood ready, its twin booms gleaming in the early sunlight. Colonel Charles MacDonald stood beside his fighter, reviewing the mission briefing in his mind. Patrol northeast, possible enemy supply barges near Samate Island. Nothing unusual. Except for one thing. Flying with them today was a man who wasn't supposed to be there. A civilian, dressed in borrowed flight gear, calm as if he were heading for a Sunday stroll. Charles Lindbergh approached, helmet in one hand, logbook tucked under his arm. He glanced toward the horizon, and then at the sleek shape of his Lightning. "Weather's good," he said quietly. "Visibility should hold." MacDonald nodded, though he wasn't listening to the weather. His eyes kept returning to the engine settings scribbled in his notes. 1,600 revolutions per minute, 30 inches manifold, auto lean. Every instinct told him it was madness. Every training manual agreed. And yet, curiosity pushed back against fear. Major Thomas Maguire, one of the best pilots in the Pacific, would fly Lindbergh's wing. He had volunteered, half out of confidence, half out of disbelief. If anyone could prove the civilian wrong, it was Maguire. At 0530, the four Lightnings rolled toward the runway, engines growling low. The tropical air shimmered under the rising sun as each aircraft lifted into the sky, climbing steadily over the green edge of the island until only contrails marked their path. From the moment the formation reached altitude, the differences were clear. Lindbergh's engines didn't scream, they hummed deep and steady. The others roared at 2,200 revolutions per minute, propellers slicing the air with frantic precision. Side by side, both aircraft held the same speed, but Lindbergh's gauges told a different story. His fuel needles dropped with slow reluctance. Over the radio, his voice came calm and deliberate. "Cruise power set. RPM 1600. 30 inches manifold. Mixture auto lean. Airspeed 185 indicated." MacDonald adjusted his own dials to standard power and noted the contrast. His fuel flow indicators danced above 100 gallons per hour. Lindbergh stayed at 70. The math formed itself in his head. Over 6 hours, that meant hundreds of gallons saved. If it was real. The first hour passed uneventfully. The Pacific below glittered like hammered metal. The second hour slipped by as clouds formed low and thin. Radio chatter remained minimal, just quiet check-ins, altitude confirmations, course corrections. The steady rhythm of flight replaced tension with the hypnotic thrum of twin engines. Then came the first target. A cluster of Japanese barges anchored in a cove. Anti-aircraft guns flickered along the shoreline. "Lightning flight, prepare for ground attack," MacDonald ordered. "Throttle forward. RPM up." The four fighters dove from the sky, sunlight flashing off their wings as tracers arced upward from the ground. The air trembled with power. Lindbergh's plane held formation perfectly, engines roaring now under combat power, but his movements were precise, measured, no wasted energy, no erratic dives. 12 minutes later, the attack was over. Smoke curled from the shoreline. The formation climbed back toward the clouds, engines throttling back to cruise. MacDonald scanned his instruments and called across the radio, "Fuel check." Maguire's voice crackled back, steady and brief. 60% remaining. Another pilot followed. 58. Then came Lindbergh. 72%. MacDonald blinked. He repeated the transmission. "Say again, 4? 72 confirmed," Lindbergh answered. Fuel flow averaging 70 gallons total per hour. The cockpit fell silent, except for the steady hum of engines. The numbers didn't make sense. No one saved that much fuel, certainly not after a combat engagement. But Lindbergh's voice carried no pride, no excitement. Just quiet certainty. Hour after hour, the truth became undeniable. His gauges dropped slower, his engines ran smoother, and when the coast of New Guinea finally reappeared, his tanks still held enough for another hour of flight. When the four planes rolled to a stop on the field, the crews ran forward with their measuring sticks. The results were immediate and precise. MacDonald's Lightning carried 18% fuel remaining. Maguire, 19. Lindbergh, 34. The ground chief frowned and checked again. Then he checked a third time. The numbers didn't move. "Sir," he said slowly, "this man's using 30% less fuel than anyone else on the field." MacDonald stared at the numbers until the reality sank in. The impossible had just become measurable. Over the next week, Lindbergh flew mission after mission. Some patrols, some escorts, some experimental runs designed solely to collect data. Each time, the results matched within a few percentage points. 30% less fuel. Cooler cylinder temperatures. No engine failures. The mechanics began to notice first. They were the ones who checked plugs, replaced filters, and logged every pressure reading. Sergeant Kowalski, a veteran who could diagnose an Allison engine by the sound of its idle, pulled MacDonald aside one afternoon. "Sir," he said, "either that civilians got magic hands, or everything we've been taught about cruise power's dead wrong." MacDonald didn't answer. He didn't have to. But not everyone was convinced. Some pilots refused to touch their throttles below the standard settings. Others tried once and reported that it felt wrong, like waiting for a hidden explosion. Lieutenant Hayes returned from his first experiment pale and shaking. "It felt unnatural, sir," he said quietly. "The engines were too quiet. I kept thinking they'd die any second." "And did they?" MacDonald asked. Hayes shook his head. "No, sir. They ran fine. And I saved 100 gallons. The truth was spreading faster than command could contain it. The manuals said one thing. The sky said another. By the third week of July, the debate turned into open challenge. Major Peterson, one of the oldest and most decorated pilots in the group, confronted Lindbergh directly in the operations tent. "Mr. Lindbergh," he said, "you're asking men to gamble their lives on a trick. You're telling them to fly against everything they were trained to do." Lindbergh didn't flinch. "Major, what you were trained for were short flights, safe conditions, generous fuel margins. Out here, those rules don't apply. You're fighting an ocean, not a textbook." Peterson crossed his arms. "And if we blow an engine, then you'll know exactly how far truth can fly," Lindbergh replied quietly. The tent fell silent. No one dared interrupt the standoff between the legend and the veteran. But that same evening, as the sun fell red over the jungle, Peterson signed up for the next mission. July 28, 1944. The mission to Wewak was supposed to be routine, an escort for bombers targeting supply installations. Intelligence warned of possible enemy fighters, but nothing the group hadn't faced before. Lindbergh would fly on McGuire's wing again. Peterson joined the second element, determined to test the ruined engine theory under real combat stress. They lifted off just after dawn, climbing east into clear skies. 400 miles to target, 400 back. 8 hours, maybe more. The formation crossed the coast 2 hours later, sunlight glinting off the ocean below. The first contact came from the northwest, 10 dots growing fast against the sky. Zeros. The radio came alive with clipped voices. "Bandits. 11 o'clock high." The formation split, P-38s banking hard into the sun. Tracers arced across the blue. The air filled with the rattle of machine guns and the distant thunder of engines at full power. MacDonald watched from above, directing the engagement. Lindbergh stayed glued to McGuire's wing, matching every turn with effortless precision. His movements were deliberate, efficient, no wild maneuvers, no unnecessary climbs. Even in combat, his throttle discipline held. One Japanese fighter broke from the melee, diving straight toward Lindbergh's plane. McGuire shouted a warning, but the civilian pilot was already reacting. A sharp roll, a burst of cannon fire, and the Zero disintegrated in a spray of smoke and flame. Lindbergh's voice came over the radio, calm as ever. "One bandit down. Forming up." The dogfight raged for 20 minutes before the sky finally cleared. 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed. No American losses. But the battle had drained fuel from every Lightning, every one except Lindbergh's. When MacDonald ordered the return, the reports came in. 30% remaining. 26. 29. Then Lindbergh's voice again. 42%. They landed after 8 hours and 20 minutes in the air. The men climbed from their cockpits like ghosts, dehydrated and trembling. Yet when the ground crews checked, Lindbergh's tanks still sloshed heavy. Enough fuel for nearly 2 more hours of flight. No detonation. No overheating. No damage. For the first time, Peterson sought Lindbergh out. The older pilot looked at the ground for a long moment before speaking. "I was wrong," he said. "We all were." Lindbergh nodded once. "You weren't wrong, Major. You were careful. Now you're smarter." By the end of July, every squadron in the group was testing the new technique. Pilots who'd once refused to touch their throttles below 2,000 revolutions per minute now set them to 1,600 without hesitation. Every flight confirmed the same results: 30% fuel savings, no engine failure, and an extra hour or more of endurance. The sound of the airfield itself began to change. The furious roar of engines starting at high RPM gave way to a deeper, steadier hum. Mechanics noticed cooler exhaust temperatures. Maintenance crews logged fewer cylinder replacements. The numbers on the board told a story no one could ignore. The rules of flight had changed, not in a laboratory, not in a classroom, but on a humid airstrip carved from the jungles of New Guinea. And the man who changed them wasn't wearing a uniform. By August 1944, the transformation was complete. Across the Pacific, from the humid airfields of New Guinea to the coral runways of the Philippines, the sound of twin-engine lightnings had changed. The furious metallic scream of high-revving Allisons gave way to a steady, confident hum. Pilots once obsessed with following manuals now trusted the lessons of experience. Less power, longer range, cooler engines. The numbers didn't lie. Colonel Charles MacDonald stood in the operations tent one morning, watching as fuel charts and flight logs piled up on his desk. The data was staggering. Fuel consumption had dropped by nearly a third across the entire 475th Fighter Group. Average mission duration had increased by more than 40%. And most important of all, engine failures had decreased. The ground crews who had once scoffed at Lindbergh's crazy civilian tricks were now teaching new arrivals how to adjust mixture controls, balance manifold pressure, and lean out for cruise. Mechanics compared where patterns and found smoother pistons, cleaner plugs, and fewer cracked cylinder heads. Sergeant Kowalski, the old mechanic who could read an engine like a doctor reads a pulse, grinned as he flipped through his inspection log. "Sir," he told MacDonald, "these Allisons are running better than they ever have. Lower stress, cooler temps, less corrosion. If this is ruining engines, I'll take ruined engines any day." MacDonald smiled, though part of him still struggled to comprehend how quickly the world had changed. Just a month earlier, men would have called Lindbergh reckless for suggesting what now seemed obvious. Doctrine had crumbled under the weight of proof. The revolution spread faster than orders could be written. Word traveled by pilots, those informal channels that carried truth faster than bureaucracy ever could. Messages crossed the Pacific through radio chatter and personal letters. "Try low RPM," one squadron wrote to another. "You'll gain 100 miles of range. Maybe more." From Australia to the Solomon Islands, fighter groups began experimenting. Reports flowed back with the same result. 30% fuel savings, identical performance, and no engine damage. Colonel Lewis walked into MacDonald's tent one afternoon, a grin hidden beneath the weariness of too many missions. He tossed a report on the desk. "The 432nd just completed an 8-hour escort to Borneo," he said. "Full formation made it home with fuel to spare. No one had to ditch. First time that's ever happened." MacDonald picked up the report and read the figures twice. 8 hours of continuous flight had once been the stuff of fantasy for a P-38 unit. Now it was routine. The Pacific, once impossibly vast, suddenly felt smaller. For the pilots, the difference wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. Flying with constant fear of fuel starvation had been its own kind of battle. Every mission used to be a math problem with no room for error. Each man had memorized his point of no return, that invisible line in the sky where turning back meant death either way. But with the new settings, that fear began to fade. They could stay over target longer. They could climb higher, chase farther, return with fuel still sloshing in the tanks. For the first time, they could fight the way they wanted instead of the way their fuel gauges allowed. Lieutenant Hayes, once the nervous skeptic, now logged every flight in meticulous detail. His entries read like revelations. Cruise 1,600 revolutions per minute, 30 inches manifold, 185 miles per hour. 8 hours airborne. Landed with 70 gallons remaining. He had flown more than 200 hours using Lindbergh's method without a single engine issue. The fear that once shadowed every mission had turned into quiet confidence. The change rippled upward through the chain of command. Squadron leaders revised training lectures. Field manuals were rewritten. The words, "never run over square," began to disappear from classroom walls. In the weeks that followed, Lindbergh himself faded from the spotlight. He never asked for credit, never posed for photographs, never gave speeches. He flew, observed, advised, and then quietly prepared to leave. On his final morning at Hollandia, the airfield buzzed with activity as usual. Aircrews shouting over engines, mechanics rolling fuel drums, officers planning the day's missions. Lindbergh stood beside MacDonald's P-38, the morning sun glinting off the aircraft's silver skin. MacDonald joined him, still in his flight gear. "You're heading back stateside?" Lindbergh nodded. "My work here's done. You don't need me anymore." "That's not true," MacDonald said. "We needed you to remind us that thinking isn't disobedience." Lindbergh smiled faintly. "War teaches obedience, but progress requires risk." He offered his hand. MacDonald shook it firmly. "You've changed how we fly." "No," Lindbergh replied. "You changed how you think." With that, he turned and walked toward the waiting transport plane. Within minutes, he was gone, leaving behind a legacy written not in speeches or medals, but in gallons saved, lives spared, and miles conquered. By late August, the new procedures had become standard operating practice across the Pacific. Commanders who had once dismissed the technique now insisted their men master it. Training programs incorporated the new power settings. Instructor pilots revised lesson plans overnight. The results were undeniable. Missions that once required dangerous refueling stops could now be flown non-stop. Escort fighters could accompany bombers deeper into enemy territory, striking targets that had previously been unreachable. Strategically, the Allies had gained something invaluable: time. Each additional hour of flight meant more flexibility, more surprise, more opportunity. The P-38, once considered limited by range, had become the long arm of the Pacific Air Forces. Even ground logistics changed. Fuel shipments could be reduced. Storage demands eased. The ripple effects reached across islands and fleets. When headquarters compiled the official reports, the numbers spoke with absolute clarity. Combat radius increased by 31%. Fuel consumption reduced by 30%. Mission duration extended by 40%. What had begun as one man's quiet defiance had become a logistical revolution. Months later, back in the United States, new pilots entering flight school began learning the updated procedures. They never knew how controversial those ideas had once been. They didn't know that men in the jungles of New Guinea had risked their lives to prove them. To them, the method was simply standard procedure. But to the men who had lived through that transformation, it was something deeper. A reminder that the difference between failure and progress often lies in questioning the impossible. For the veterans of the 475th, every flight that ended safely carried the echo of that lesson. Every quiet engine, every extended range, every successful return from distant skies was proof that one person's conviction could change the outcome of a war. In the months that followed, the story spread quietly through the ranks. They called it Lindbergh's miracle in hushed tones, half in jest, half in reverence. But to the pilots who had seen their fuel gauges drop slower, who had felt the tension ease in their chests during long flights, it was no miracle. It was simple truth, finally proven. Even long after the war ended, engineers would cite the data from those Pacific missions when designing new aircraft. Jet engines, turboprops, and long-range bombers all carried echoes of the lesson learned in 1944. Efficiency was not the enemy of power, it was the secret to endurance. Lindbergh's brief time in the Pacific had reshaped more than tactics. It had reminded an entire generation of pilots that innovation doesn't always come from new machines. Sometimes it comes from rethinking the ones we already have. Years later, Colonel MacDonald would reflect on those days in letters and interviews. He spoke of Lindbergh not as a celebrity, but as a quiet teacher who appeared when the Air Forces needed him most. "He didn't lecture," MacDonald once wrote. "He showed us. He climbed into the cockpit, faced the same dangers, and proved the truth with his own hands." In war, you don't argue with results. And the results had been undeniable. The Pacific Campaign moved forward with newfound strength. Fighter escorts reached deeper into enemy lines. Pilots who might have been lost to fuel exhaustion lived to fly again. Every mission completed with fuel to spare felt like a small victory over fear itself. When the war finally ended, many of those same pilots returned home, carrying memories of heat, exhaustion, and endless ocean. But one image stayed with them more than any dogfight or explosion. The sight of a calm, middle-aged man in khaki standing beside a silver lightning, explaining that everything they'd been taught might be wrong. In the silence that followed, as years turned into decades, that moment grew larger than any single mission. It became a symbol of what courage truly means. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to question certainty. Because in the end, Lindbergh hadn't just taught them how to fly farther. He had taught them how to think differently. If you love true stories of forgotten heroes, groundbreaking innovations, and moments that changed history, this video is for you. Anchor subscribe now for more powerful hidden stories from World War II and Cold War aviation. Speech balloon comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Thumbs up like this video to help more history lovers discover it. Military Metal joined the mission to keep these stories alive, because history's greatest revolutions often start with one person who refused to say, "That's just how it's done."